In the bitter cold of a December night in rural upstate New York, Amelia Carter and her 2 young children were barely surviving in their crumbling wooden cottage. A 27-year-old widow with a daughter battling a failing heart and a son who still asked when Daddy was coming home. She had nothing left but her dignity and the desperate hope that tomorrow might be kinder. Then one stormy evening, fate delivered a dying stranger to her doorstep, a man in an expensive tailored suit, bleeding heavily from what looked like bullet wounds, his black Mercedes overturned in the snow beside him. Despite having barely enough food to feed her own children, Amelia could not turn away a soul in need. She dragged him inside, tended his wounds with her trembling hands, and shared their last can of soup. Little did this struggling widow know that she had just saved the life of the most dangerous Mafia boss on the East Coast, and her single act of kindness would transform not just the mysterious stranger's fate, but the destiny of her entire family. What dark secrets was this wounded man carrying that would change everything for the poor widow who saved him? And why were the people who shot him willing to kill anyone who knew he was still alive? Before we dive deeper into this story, tell us where you are watching from in the comments. If this story touches your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. And do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss what happens next. Sometimes, the greatest love stories begin with a single act of mercy on the darkest night. But to understand how that fateful night changed Amelia Carter's life forever, we must turn back the clock 8 months earlier, to the day her world completely collapsed. Amelia still remembered that morning with painful clarity, standing in the small kitchen of her husband's family home, one hand resting on her 3-month pregnant belly, the other gently stirring a bowl of porridge for Sophie and Ethan. Michael, her husband, kissed her forehead before heading out, telling her he'd be home early because it was Sophie's birthday. That was the last time she ever saw him alive. That afternoon, 2 police officers appeared at the front door, their faces heavy with sympathy. They said Michael's car had lost its brakes on a mountain road and plunged into a ravine 50 meters deep. He died instantly. Amelia collapsed at the doorway, and in the depths of her agony, she felt warm blood running down her thighs. The child in her womb, the child Michael never even got to know the gender of, left her to follow its father. In a single day, Amelia lost both the man she loved and the child she never got to hold. But the tragedy didn't end there. Her husband's family, the people she believed would support her in her darkest hour, turned their backs on her with ruthless cruelty. Her mother-in-law, Margaret Carter, stood directly in front of her at Michael's funeral and said that if Amelia hadn't forced her husband to work extra hours to pay off debts, he wouldn't have died. She placed all the blame on Amelia, called her husband's killer, and 1 week after the funeral, she threw Amelia and the 2 children out of the main house. The only thing she gave them was a decaying wooden cabin on the edge of the property, a place even the servants refused to live in. Amelia carried her children into that house with its leaking roof, cracked walls, and a heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Sophie, her 8-year-old daughter, looked at her mother with eyes far older than her age and said, "It was okay, Mom. We still have each other." Those words alone gave Amelia the strength to stand again. But fate still wasn't finished with her. Just 2 months after Michael's death, Sophie began showing strange symptoms. She was constantly exhausted, short of breath, and sometimes clutched her chest as if her heart were being squeezed by an invisible hand. Amelia rushed her to the hospital, where Dr. Williams looked at her with deep compassion and explained that Sophie had a congenital heart condition, a valve defect that had gone undetected for years. The child needed surgery within 6 months, or her small heart would stop beating. The cost of the operation was $200,000, a number Amelia couldn't even begin to comprehend. She sold everything she could: her wedding ring, the necklace her mother had left her before passing away, the family silverware, even the wedding dress she had treasured like a sacred memory. But it was only enough to cover a small portion of the medical bills and rent. The bank called every week, the voices on the line growing colder each time. 3 months, they said. And if the debt wasn't paid, even this fragile wooden house would be seized. Then there was Tony, the loan shark Michael had borrowed from before his death. He showed up at her door every week, his dull eyes roaming over her body with a hunger that made her skin crawl. He told her that if she didn't have money, she could pay in other ways. And more than once, his rough hands tried to grab her before she managed to escape. Amelia worked 3 jobs a day. At dawn, she cleaned houses for 3 families in town. In the afternoon, she took in sewing work, and at night she sold eggs and vegetables from the small garden behind the cabin. She slept no more than 4 hours a night, ate no more than 1 meal a day, giving everything to Sophie and Ethan. Her hands grew calloused, her back ached constantly, but she didn't dare stop, because every time she looked into Sophie's eyes, she knew time was running out. And late at night, When the children were finally asleep, Amelia knelt beside her bed, tears streaming down her face, and prayed to God for a miracle. She had no idea that miracle would arrive in the form of a blood-soaked man on a snowstorm night, and that it would change everything in ways she never could have imagined. That night, Amelia's small wooden cabin turned into a makeshift emergency room while the snowstorm howled outside. After she and the two children struggled together to drag the large man inside and lay him on the only worn-out bed in the house, Amelia finally had the chance to examine his injuries beneath the faint glow of the oil lamp. Blood was still flowing from the wound in his chest, soaking through the expensive white shirt beneath his suit jacket. She cut away the fabric, and her heart tightened when she saw the bullet still lodged there, trapped just beneath his ribs. She knew she had to remove it, or he would die from infection long before he could reach a hospital. And the nearest hospital was more than 40 kilometers away. With no way for anyone to travel through a storm like this, Sophie, her daughter, stood beside her with wide eyes filled with worry. Yet she didn't cry. The girl asked what her mother needed, and Amelia told her to hold the oil lamp steady. Ethan was tasked with boiling water on the wood stove and gathering every clean piece of cloth he could find. Amelia took the tweezers from her sewing kit, passed them through the flame to sterilize them, and began a task she never imagined she would have to do. When she inserted the tweezers into the wound, the man let out a low groan of pain despite still being unconscious. Amelia bit her lip, her hands trembling, but she didn't stop. She had cared for her own mother during her final days while she fought cancer, and she had learned how to stay calm in the worst situations imaginable. After nearly 20 minutes of suffocating tension, the bullet finally came free and dropped onto a chipped ceramic plate with a sharp metallic clink. Blood poured out even faster, and Amelia quickly pressed cloths firmly against the wound, holding them there until the flow slowed and finally stopped. She cleaned the injury with warm salt water, applied the last of the antibiotic ointment left over from Sophie's previous infection, and carefully wrapped the wound with strips torn from an old bedsheet. But her work didn't end there. The man developed a high fever, his body burning like hot coals, sweat soaking the pillow beneath his head. He began to drift into delirium, his head turning from side to side, his lips murmuring broken fragments of words. Amelia sat beside him, wiping sweat from his forehead with a damp cloth, trying every method she knew to bring the fever down. It was during those long hours that she heard him call out a woman's name. "Catherine," he whispered, his voice torn apart by pain. "I'm sorry. I couldn't protect you." Then he spoke another name. "My son, Thomas. I'm sorry. I failed you." Tears slipped from the corners of the man's tightly closed eyes, and Amelia felt her heart twist. She didn't know who Catherine and Thomas were, but she recognized the pain in his voice, the same pain she had felt when she lost Michael and the child she never got to hold. This man, whoever he was, carried wounds no one could see, wounds far deeper than the bullet in his chest. Sophie sat beside her mother, her eyes heavy with sleep yet refusing to leave. She looked at the strange man and asked if he was crying. Amelia nodded, and Sophie said maybe he lost someone too, like we lost Dad. Amelia's heart softened at her daughter's compassion. She pulled Sophie into her arms, kissed her hair, and told her to go to sleep because they would need to wake early in the morning. Ethan had long since fallen asleep on the wooden chair near the stove, exhausted after running back and forth to help his mother for hours. Amelia gently lifted him, laid him in bed beside Sophie, tucked the blankets around them, then returned to the bedside of the wounded stranger. She stayed awake the entire night, never taking her eyes off him. She replaced the cold cloth whenever it warmed, wiped away sweat, checked the wound, and prayed silently in her heart, asking that he wouldn't die in this house. Outside, the storm slowly eased as dawn approached. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the snow-covered window and filled the small room. And as if that light carried a miracle with it, Amelia placed her hand on the man's forehead and realized the fever had broken. He was still unconscious, but his breathing was steadier, his face no longer twisted in pain. He had survived the worst of it. Amelia let out a long breath, and for the first time in many months, she felt as though she had done something right. She didn't know who this man was, didn't know why he had been shot, didn't know what secrets he carried. But in that moment, none of it mattered. What mattered was that he was still alive, and she had saved a life. 2 days passed inside that small wooden cabin, and Amelia barely left the bedside of the unknown man. She changed his bandages twice each day, forced him to drink water and thin porridge by gently tilting his head and pouring each small spoonful past his cracked lips. The fever had completely subsided, the wound had begun to heal, and color was slowly returning to his once ashen face. Then, on the afternoon of the second day, as Amelia sat by the fire reheating a bowl of porridge, She heard movement from the inner room. A faint groan, then the soft rustle of fabric. She rose at once and hurried inside. And that was when she saw the man's eyes open for the first time. They were dark gray, like the sky before a storm, sharp and wary. The instant he woke, though his body was still weak, those eyes swept the room with the instinct of a predator searching for danger. They paused on the door, the window, every shadowed corner where a threat might hide, and only then did they settle on Amelia's face. The man tried to sit up, but pain tore through his chest and forced a groan from his throat as he fell back onto the pillow. Memory seemed to surge back into him, because Amelia saw those eyes darken for a brief moment, as if he were reliving something horrifying. He remembers, she thought, the night he was shot and nearly died. His voice broke the silence, hoarse from days of disuse, yet still carrying an authority that almost made Amelia step back. "Who are you?" he asked. "Where is this place?" His gray eyes fixed on her as if trying to read every thought in her mind. Amelia stood still, the bowl of porridge still in her hands, and replied in a calm voice that surprised even herself. "I'm the one who saved your life," she said, "and this is my home. You were badly wounded and nearly died in the snowstorm. I removed the bullet from your chest and took care of you for 2 days." The man frowned, clearly unaccustomed to being spoken to that way. He glanced down at his chest, saw the white bandages wrapped tightly around it, then looked back at Amelia with an expression caught between suspicion and curiosity. "You took the bullet out," he said, more a statement than a question. "By yourself?" Amelia nodded, offering no further explanation. She stepped closer, set the bowl of porridge on the small wooden table beside the bed, and told him he should eat something, that he hadn't had a proper meal in 2 days. He didn't touch the bowl at once, instead continuing to study her with that probing gaze. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice low and deliberate, as if testing her. Amelia met his eyes without the slightest fear and answered that no, she didn't know, and she didn't care. She only knew he was someone who needed help, and she had given it. Now that he was awake, he should eat to regain his strength, and when he was well enough, he could go wherever he wished. The man fell silent for a long moment, his gray eyes never leaving her face. For 10 years, since he rose to lead the Moretti family, no one had dared speak to him in such a tone. No one had dared meet his gaze without lowering their head. No one had ever shown indifference to his identity. Yet this woman, with her calloused hands and worn clothes, stood before him without fear, even with a trace of irritation in her voice, as if saving a wounded stranger were nothing more than a small inconvenience in her day. He didn't know why, but it intrigued him more than anything had in many years. At last, he reached for the bowl of porridge and lifted a spoonful to his mouth. It was thin and bland, seasoned only with a little salt and a few slices of ginger. But it was the best thing he had ever tasted, because it was the first food he had eaten after escaping death. While he ate, Amelia stood by the window, gazing out at the snow-covered yard. She didn't look at him, as if his presence in her home were merely temporary, not something worth much thought. And it was that attitude, that strange, steady calm, that made Nico Moretti feel, for the first time in his life, that he might not be the most frightening person in the room. The following afternoon, while Amelia was busy washing clothes in the backyard, Sophie tiptoed into the room where the injured man was resting. She held a glass of water in her hands, her steps careful as if afraid to disturb him, while her wide eyes kept flicking toward the man on the bed with a mix of curiosity and hesitation. Nico had his eyes closed, resting, but the instincts of a man who had survived in the underworld made him immediately aware that someone had entered the room. He opened his eyes, and instead of the serious face of the woman who had saved him, he saw a thin little girl with brown hair, braided into 2 plaits, standing beside the bed, her lips pressed together as if she were gathering all her courage. "I brought you water," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom said you need to drink a lot so you can get better faster." Nico looked at her, and something in his chest tightened in a strange and unexpected way. The girl was about 8 years old, nearly the age Thomas would have been if his son were still alive. Her eyes weren't like Thomas's, but the way she looked at him, half frightened and half curious, reminded him of the times Thomas used to sneak into his office to see what his father was doing. He reached out to take the glass of water, making an effort to soften his voice as he said thank you. Sophie's eyes widened in surprise, as if she hadn't expected this frightening man to know how to say thank you. She smiled, a small smile, yet bright enough to light up the dim room. And it was that smile that made Nico's heart, the heart he thought had gone numb 5 years earlier, suddenly stir. At that moment, a boy of about 6 burst into the room like a small whirlwind, his eyes shining with excitement. Ethan rushed to the bedside, showing none of his sister's fear, and stared at Nico with open admiration. "Mister," the boy asked, his voice bursting with enthusiasm, "are you a superhero? Mom said you were shot and didn't die. Only superheroes don't die when they get shot." Sophie hurried to pull her brother's hand, telling him he shouldn't ask questions like that, but Ethan wouldn't be quiet. He kept asking what superpowers Nico had, whether he could fly, whether he was as strong as Superman. Nico looked at the boy, and for the first time in many years, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "No," he replied, his voice deep but no longer cold. "I'm not a superhero. I'm just someone who was lucky enough to be saved by your mother." Ethan looked a little disappointed at first, but then his face brightened again as he said it was okay. "Even if you're not a superhero, you're still really cool, because you have a bullet scar and you drive a Mercedes." Sophie gently took her brother's hand and told him they should let the man rest. But before leaving, she turned back to Nico and said softly that she was glad he didn't die, that her mom stayed up all night taking care of him. And if he had died, her mom would have been very sad. Then the two children ran outside, leaving Nico alone in the room with a heart beating wildly in his chest. He didn't understand why the innocent words of two children could reach him so deeply, why the smile of that thin little girl made him ache for Thomas until it nearly stole his breath, why the foolish questions of a 6-year-old boy made him want to smile for the first time in 5 years. Outside the doorway, Amelia had been standing there for some time, silently watching everything. She saw the look in the man's eyes as he watched her children, and she realized it wasn't the look of a dangerous man, not the look of someone cold-blooded. It was the look of a father, a man who had once loved a child and had lost that child. She didn't know his story, didn't know who Catherine and Thomas were, the names he whispered in delirium, but she knew one thing. Behind those ice-cold eyes was a heart that had once been shattered. The days that followed passed slowly inside the small wooden cabin, and Nico was forced to remain still in bed to give his wound time to heal. For a man who was accustomed to commanding an empire, used to giving orders to hundreds and deciding the fate of thousands, lying motionless like someone useless was a form of torture. Yet it was precisely this time that gave him the chance to observe the life of the small family that had saved him. And what he saw caused his frozen heart to begin melting little by little. Every day, Amelia woke before dawn, around 4 in the morning when the entire world was still wrapped in darkness. Nico knew this because he couldn't sleep either, and he heard her soft footsteps moving through the house, the crackle of wood as she lit the stove, the sound of water boiling as she prepared breakfast for her children. Then she left before the sun rose, leaving Sophie and Ethan with a few gentle instructions, and didn't return until the sky was completely dark. He heard the children say that their mother went to clean other people's houses, that she took in sewing work at night, that she sold eggs and vegetables at the market every weekend. One woman working 3 jobs a day just to feed 2 children and a stranger lying injured in her bed. What hurt Nico the most was the way Amelia divided the food at every meal. She always gave Sophie and Ethan the larger portions, the bigger pieces of meat when there was meat, the thicker spoonfuls of porridge, while her own share was mostly water and a few strands of vegetables. Many times he saw her sit at the table watching her children eat, telling them that she had already eaten, that she wasn't hungry, but he knew it was a lie because he heard her stomach growl in the silence of the kitchen. She was starving herself so her children could be full, and it made him think of Catherine, of how his wife had once sacrificed everything for Thomas without ever complaining. Then there were moments when Nico witnessed Sophie coughing, long fits that made the girl clutch her chest, her face twisting in pain. She tried to cough as quietly as possible so her mother wouldn't hear, tried to hide her suffering so her mother wouldn't worry, but Nico saw everything. He saw her lips turn pale after each fit, saw her small hands tremble as they gripped the fabric over her chest, and he understood that her illness was far more serious than it appeared. Ethan, young as he was, understood it too. The 6-year-old often gave his portion to his sister, saying he was full, telling her to eat, even though he was still hungry. Once Nico saw the boy secretly slip a boiled egg into his sister's pocket when she wasn't looking, then lie to their mother and say he had eaten everything already. Only 6 years old, and the boy already knew how to sacrifice, how to protect his sister in his own way. Nico looked at him and saw Thomas, remembered how his own son had once been just as innocent and kind before everything was torn away from him. One evening, when Amelia thought Nico was asleep, he heard the phone ring. She stepped out onto the back porch to answer it, but her voice still carried inside through the thin door. First it was a call from the bank, and he heard her beg in a trembling voice, "Please give me more time. I'll earn the money. Please don't take our house." Then came another call, this time from the hospital, and her voice sounded even more desperate as she asked if there was no other way, no assistance program, because her daughter would die without surgery. The call ended, and Nico heard her footsteps returning inside. He opened his eyes slightly and looked through the narrow gap, and what he saw made his heart feel as if it were being crushed. Amelia was sitting in a dark corner of the kitchen, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she cried. She cried without a sound, swallowing every sob so her children wouldn't hear, but the pain spilled out in the tears streaming down her cheeks. She was carrying everything alone, crushing debt, a gravely ill daughter, a house about to be taken away, and no one to lean on. Nico lay in the darkness, watching that woman cry, and he wondered how shoulders so slender could bear so much. He had met many people in his life, the powerful, the wealthy, the ruthless, but he had never met anyone as resilient as this woman. And that night, Nico Moretti, the coldest mafia boss on the east coast of the United States, made a silent decision. He would repay this woman, by any means necessary, whether she wanted it or not. One afternoon, while Amelia was out delivering sewn items to a client and Ethan was asleep for his midday nap, Sophie walked into Nico's room with a glass of water as she usually did. But this time, instead of setting the glass down and leaving, she lingered beside the bed, her wide eyes fixed on Nico, as if there were something she wanted to say. Nico noticed the change at once. He asked softly if something was wrong, and as if she had been waiting for that question, Sophie climbed onto the wooden chair beside the bed, sat down, and began to talk. At first, it was only small, scattered things, about the school she had to stop attending because there was no money to pay the fees, about the old doll she still hugged every night even though it was worn and torn, about Ethan and the mischief her little brother always got into. Then, little by little, her voice grew quieter, her gaze dropping to her hands folded together in her lap. "Do you know," Sophie said, her voice barely a whisper, "my mom cries every night." Nico stayed silent. He knew it already. He had seen it with his own eyes the night before, but he wanted her to continue. Sophie said her mother thought she didn't know, but she knew everything. She could hear her mother crying after she went to sleep. Her mom tried to cry very softly, but the house was so small that Sophie could still hear it. She cried because she missed Dad. She cried because she worried about money. She cried because Sophie was sick. Nico felt his chest tighten as he listened to those words spoken by an 8-year-old child. He asked Sophie about her father, and she told him that her dad had died 8 months ago, that his car had crashed, and that people said he had gone to heaven to be with God. Her voice was frighteningly calm, as if she had grown used to loss, as if she had accepted it as part of life. Then Sophie lifted her head and looked at Nico, and what she said next felt like a punch straight to his heart. "Uncle," she said, "I'm going to die soon too, like Dad." Nico froze, unable to believe what he had just heard. Sophie went on, her voice still painfully calm. "I heard the doctor talking to Mom at the hospital last time. The doctor said my heart is broken and needs surgery, but Mom doesn't have money, so I won't get the surgery, and if I don't get it, I'll die. I'm only 8, but I know what dying means. It means I'll go to where Dad is, and I'll never see Mom and Ethan again." Nico felt his eyes burn, a sensation he hadn't known since the day he buried his wife and son. He asked Sophie if she was scared, and her answer nearly broke him. "I'm not scared of dying," Sophie shook her head. "I'm just scared. Mom will be sad. Mom cried so much when Dad died. If I die too, she'll cry even more. I don't want Mom to cry. I want her to smile, but I don't know how to make my heart stop being broken." Nico looked at the thin little girl in front of him, an 8-year-old child with a failing heart and the soul of an angel. She wasn't afraid of death, only afraid of her mother's sorrow. She didn't cry for herself, only for the pain of others. And in that moment, Nico saw Thomas in Sophie. He saw the same innocence and kindness his son once had before it was stolen from this world. He didn't think. He simply acted on instinct. He reached out, took Sophie's small hand in his, and looked straight into her eyes. "Sophie," he said, his voice deep and steady, "you won't die. I promise you." Sophie's eyes widened in surprise, but Nico tightened his grip on her hand. "I don't know how yet, but I promise you'll have the surgery. You'll be healthy, and you'll live to see your mom smile every day. This is my promise to you." It was the first promise Nico Moretti had spoken in 5 years. Since the day he stood beside the graves of his wife and son and swore he would never promise anything to anyone again, because every promise he made turned into a lie. But as he looked into Sophie's clear eyes, he knew this was a promise he would keep at any cost, even if it meant trading his own life. That evening, after the children had gone to sleep and Amelia was sitting under the faint glow of the oil lamp, sewing quietly, Nico called her over and made a request. He said he needed to borrow her phone to contact his people, his voice low and serious. Amelia looked at him with caution and asked who he intended to call, and whether it would bring danger to her family. Nico replied that he only needed to contact someone he trusted to let them know he was still alive, and he promised he wouldn't allow any danger to come near this house. Amelia hesitated for a long moment, then finally handed him her old phone. Its screen cracked at one corner, and told him she would trust him this once. But if anything happened to her children, she would kill him with her own hands, no matter who he was. Nico almost laughed at the threat, but he restrained himself and simply nodded. When Amelia returned to the inner room, Nico dialed a number he had known by heart for more than 10 years. After only 2 rings, the familiar voice of Marco Benedetti came through the line, filled with worry and panic. "Boss," Marco nearly shouted. "Where are you? Are you all right? We've been looking for you everywhere for almost 2 weeks. The police found your car overturned but no body. Castellano is telling everyone you're dead." Nico cut him off with his familiar cold tone and said he was alive and in a safe place, but he needed Marco to do several things immediately. Marco fell silent at once and listened, because that was how their relationship had worked for more than 20 years. Nico gave orders and Marco carried them out, without asking why. Nico began listing what he needed. First, investigate everything about the Carter family, about Amelia Carter and her 2 children, about her deceased husband Michael Carter, and about the true cause of the car accident 8 months earlier. Second, find every debt Amelia was carrying: bank loans, loan shark debts, hospital bills, everything. Third, prepare $200,000 and transfer it to the hospital to cover the cost of heart surgery for Sophie Carter, Amelia's daughter. Fourth, pay off all of her debts without letting her know where the money came from. Marco was silent for a long moment on the other end of the line, and when he finally spoke, his voice was filled with undisguised astonishment. "Boss," he said slowly, "I've followed you for more than 20 years, and I've never seen you help an outsider like this. Who is this woman that makes you do all of this?" Nico was quiet for a moment. Then he answered in a voice he barely recognized himself. Softer, more human. "She's the woman who saved my life," he said. "She dragged me out of a snowstorm, removed a bullet from my chest, and took care of me for nearly 2 weeks while she barely had anything to eat herself. She's carrying the weight of the entire world on her shoulders, and hasn't complained even once. I owe her my life, and I'm going to repay that debt." Marco understood immediately and said he would handle everything within 48 hours, and make sure no one would know where the money came from. Before hanging up, Marco added one last sentence that made Nico freeze. "I'm glad you're alive, boss," Marco said, his voice unusually sincere. "But I'm even more glad because it seems like you're coming back to life in another way, a way I haven't seen in you for 5 years since Catherine and Thomas were gone." Nico ended the call without replying, but deep down he knew Marco was right. Something was changing inside him, and it had begun with a woman who had calloused hands and unbreakable eyes that never bowed. 10 days had passed since the phone call with Marco, and Nico's wound had healed enough for him to walk again, though sharp movements still brought pain. During that time, life inside the small wooden cabin unfolded with an unusual calm, as if time itself had paused to allow everyone a brief rest before the coming storm. Nico began helping with small tasks around the house, fixing a chair with a broken leg, sealing the cracks in the walls so the cold wind wouldn't seep inside. He didn't speak much, but his presence made the house feel less empty, and Amelia, though she wouldn't admit it, slowly grew used to having a man in the house again after 8 months of solitude. Sophie and Ethan clung to Nico as if he had long been part of the family, and every time Amelia watched him play with the children, a strange warmth rose in her chest, a feeling she didn't dare name. Then that afternoon arrived, the afternoon when everything changed. Amelia was hanging laundry in the backyard when she heard the sound of car engines approaching from afar. Not one, but several. Their powerful, steady rumble like the beat of war drums. She let go of the shirt in her hands and stepped toward the front of the house, and what she saw made the blood in her veins turn cold. 3 jet-black SUVs were driving down the dirt road leading to her cabin, vehicles so luxurious they had never appeared in this remote countryside. They came to a stop in a neat line before the yard, and the doors opened almost in unison. Amelia pulled Sophie and Ethan behind her, clutching them tightly in her trembling arms as she watched the men step out. They were large, solid men dressed in immaculate black suits, like mourners at a funeral. Faces cold as ice, eyes sharp as razors. She counted 10 of them, 10 men who looked like professional killers, and they were walking toward her home. Amelia's heart hammered wildly in her chest. She didn't know what was happening, didn't know who these men were or why they had come. She only knew that a mother's instinct was screaming inside her to protect her children at all costs. Sophie gripped her mother's hand, her voice shaking as she asked who they were, while Ethan hid behind Amelia's legs, his wide eyes filled with terror. Then a man stepped forward from the first vehicle, tall, with salt and pepper hair and eyes sharp as a hawk's. He scanned the area before his gaze settled on the doorway of the wooden house. Amelia followed his line of sight and saw Nico standing there, stepping out from inside with a presence utterly different from the wounded man she had cared for over the past 2 weeks. He stood straight, shoulders broad, eyes cold, the way he carried himself, radiating an authority Amelia had never noticed before. And then something happened that left her frozen, forgetting how to breathe. The salt and pepper-haired man walked quickly toward Nico, and when he was only a few steps away, he stopped, bowed his head respectfully, and spoke in a voice filled with deference. "Boss, I'm relieved you're safe. The men have been worried for 2 weeks." "Boss?" Amelia heard the word and felt as if a bucket of ice water had been poured over her head. She looked at Nico, then at the man bowing before him, then at the 10 guards standing in perfect formation like statues. And everything began to fall into place in her mind, forming a terrifying picture. The expensive suit that night, the sleek black Mercedes, the gunshot wound, the way he spoke as if giving orders, the icy eyes of someone who had seen and done things ordinary people couldn't imagine. She turned back to Nico, her voice trembling as she asked who he was, who he really was. Nico looked at her, and for the first time since he woke up, he didn't know what to say. It was Marco who spoke, his voice cutting clearly through the suffocating silence. "This is Nico Moretti," he said, "the head of the Moretti family, the most powerful crime boss in the underworld of the East Coast of the United States." Amelia felt her knees weaken. She had saved a Mafia boss, brought a killer into her home with her 2 young children, fed him and sheltered him under the same roof for 2 weeks. She looked at Nico, and in her eyes there was no longer curiosity or warmth, only sheer terror and a deep, aching sense of betrayal. Amelia shoved her children behind her, retreating toward the door of the wooden cabin as if she were facing a wild beast about to strike. Her entire body trembled, not from cold, but from the violent mix of fear, rage, and betrayal tearing through her chest from the inside. "Mafia," she whispered, her voice breaking with a choking sob. "You're Mafia." Nico stepped toward her, one hand raised in a calming gesture. But Amelia backed away another step, pulling the children with her. "Don't come any closer," she shouted, her voice shattering like glass against stone. "Don't come near my children." Nico stopped. His gray eyes darkened as he saw the fear in her gaze, fear directed at him. "Amelia." He said her name, his voice low and urgent. "Let me explain." But Amelia didn't give him the chance. "Explain what?" she cut in, tears already streaming down her cheeks without her bothering to wipe them away. "Explain that you lied to me for 2 weeks? Explain that I let a Mafia boss, a killer, sleep under the same roof as my 2 small children? Do you know what I did? I stayed up all night taking care of you. I pulled a bullet out of your chest. I gave you food my children needed. I trusted you. I let my children play with you, talk to you, care about you. And now you tell me you're Mafia?" Sophie stood behind her mother, wide eyes fixed on Nico, confused and frightened by what she didn't understand. "Uncle Nico," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are you a bad man?" That innocent question stabbed straight into Nico's heart. He looked at the child he had promised to save, and he didn't know how to answer. Before he could speak, Amelia dragged Sophie and Ethan inside, standing in the doorway like a lioness shielding her cubs. "Leave," she said, her voice cold as ice even as tears kept falling. "Take your people and never come back. I don't need help from someone like you. I'd rather die than owe a debt to the Mafia." Nico stood there, staring at the woman he had begun to care about as she looked at him with hatred and contempt. He wanted to explain that he wasn't the monster she believed him to be, that he had his own rules, that he had never harmed women or children, that he truly wanted to help her and her children. But he knew she wouldn't listen now. Fear and betrayal had drowned out everything else. He turned to Marco, signaling the guards to step back, then looked at Amelia one last time. "I'll go," he said slowly. "I'll go because you want me to. But there's one thing you need to know. The people who shot me that night won't stop. They'll find out I'm alive, and they'll come for anyone who helped me. You and your children were marked the moment you pulled me into this house." Amelia went pale, but she lifted her chin, refusing to bend. "That's your problem, not mine," she replied, her voice firm despite her trembling hands. "Take your world out of our lives." Nico nodded. He said nothing more. He turned and walked toward the SUV, but before getting in, he stopped and spoke without turning back. "No matter how much you hate me, no matter if you never want to see me again, I'll protect you and your children. That's the debt I owe you for saving my life, and I'll pay it whether you accept it or not." Then he got into the vehicle. The door closed, and the 3 black SUVs drove away one by one, leaving Amelia standing alone in front of the wooden cabin with 2 sobbing children in her arms. She watched the convoy until it disappeared down the dirt road, then collapsed to her knees, clutching Sophie and Ethan, and cried as she had never cried before. She cried from fear, from betrayal, from the realization that the man she had begun to trust belonged to the dark world she had always feared. But deep inside, in a corner she didn't dare acknowledge, she cried for another reason. She cried because she knew she would miss him. She would miss the way he looked at her children, the rare smile he gave when Ethan asked foolish questions, the promise he made to Sophie that she wouldn't die. She cried because she had begun to feel something for a Mafia boss, and that realization made her hate herself. 3 days passed after Nico left, and Amelia tried to live as if nothing had happened. She still woke up at 4 in the morning, still worked 3 jobs, still gave her children the larger portions of food and went hungry herself. But something had changed. The house felt quieter now, emptier, and every time her eyes drifted to the bed where Nico had once lain, a strange sadness rose in her chest that she didn't want to acknowledge. Sophie spoke less than before. The girl often sat alone by the window, as if waiting for someone, while Ethan kept asking when Uncle Nico would come back. Amelia didn't know how to answer. She only held her children close and prayed that the nightmare was over. But she was wrong. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, just as Amelia had returned from work and was preparing dinner for her children, she heard the sound of a car stopping in front of the house. Her heart began to race. She looked out the window and saw an old pickup truck and a black sedan parked in the yard. The doors opened, and Tony stepped out, the loan shark she had been avoiding for weeks. But Tony wasn't alone. With him were 4 men she had never seen before. Men with cold faces, merciless eyes, and the bearing of professional killers. Amelia immediately pulled Sophie and Ethan into the corner of the kitchen, whispering for them to hide under the table and not come out no matter what happened. Sophie nodded, gripping her brother's hand and dragging Ethan under the table, her eyes filled with fear but no tears. The front door was kicked open, and Tony walked in with a twisted smile on his lips. "My dear Amelia," he drawled unpleasantly, "it's been a long time. You've got some important guests who want to ask about you." One of the unfamiliar men stepped forward. He was tall, with a scar running down his left cheek, and he looked at Amelia as if she were prey. "The man from that night," he said, his voice low and cold as steel. "The man you saved in the snowstorm. Where is he?" Amelia felt the blood in her veins turn to ice, but she forced herself to stay calm as she replied that she didn't know who they were talking about. The scarred man let out a humorless laugh, then signaled to his men. "Search the place," he ordered. "Find anything connected to Nico Moretti." Amelia's small home instantly turned into a battlefield. They overturned everything, smashed dishes, ripped apart pillows and mattresses, dumped out sacks of rice and jars of salt, throwing furniture aside as if hunting for hidden treasure. Amelia stood there watching strangers destroy her home, her heart feeling as if it were being crushed. But she didn't cry, she didn't beg. She stood straight and stared at them with hatred in her eyes. "Nothing here," one of the men reported after searching every corner. The scarred man turned back to Amelia, danger flashing in his eyes. He stepped up to her, and before she could react, a brutal slap struck her face, sending her crashing to the floor. "I'll ask again," he said, his voice icy. "Where is Nico Moretti?" Amelia tasted blood in her mouth. Her cheek burned and her ears rang from the force of the blow. But she lifted her head and looked at the man standing over her, answering in a trembling yet firm voice that she didn't know. He had left 3 days ago and she didn't know where he went. The scarred man studied her for a long moment, then smiled, a smile that sent a chill down Amelia's spine. "Then maybe," he said, "you need a little motivation." He turned his gaze toward the corner of the kitchen where Sophie and Ethan were hiding, and Amelia felt as if her heart had stopped. "Bring the girl out," he ordered. One of the men reached under the table, and despite Amelia's screams, he dragged Sophie out by her hair. The girl shrieked in pain and terror, her small hands clawing helplessly at the rough grip tangled in her hair. "Mom!" Sophie screamed. "Mom, please save me!" Amelia lunged toward her daughter but was restrained by 2 other men. She struggled, scratched, bit, but couldn't break free. "Let my child go," she screamed, her voice tearing apart in despair. "She's just a child. Please let her go." The scarred man pulled a gun from his jacket, walked slowly over to Sophie, and pressed the barrel against the girl's head. Sophie shook violently, tears streaming down her face, yet she still looked toward her mother as if searching for courage. Amelia collapsed to her knees, all the strength draining from her body as she saw the black gun pressed to her daughter's temple. "Please spare her," she begged through tears. "I'm begging you. She's only 8 years old. She has a heart condition. Please spare her. I truly don't know where Nico Moretti is. He left and didn't tell me anything. Please believe me. Please spare my child." The scarred man looked down at her kneeling on the floor, tears soaking her face, and he laughed. It was a cold, merciless laugh, the laugh of someone without a shred of conscience. He clicked off the safety on the gun. The sharp sound echoed through the silent house like a death bell, and Amelia knew she was about to lose her little girl. She closed her eyes, unable to look, and prayed to God for the last time in her life. But the gunshot she was waiting for never came from the weapon pressed against Sophie's head. A gunshot ripped through the night, but it didn't come from the weapon pressed against Sophie's head. The scarred man jerked violently, his eyes flying wide as he looked down at his chest where blood was already spreading. Then he collapsed onto the wooden floor like an empty sack. The gun slipped from his hand and skidded across the old planks. Everything happened too fast for anyone to react. Amelia lifted her head, her vision blurred by tears, and she saw a figure stepping in through the back door of the house. Nico Moretti emerged from the darkness like death itself made flesh, his gray eyes cold as winter ice, a gun still smoking in his hand. He didn't speak a single word. His face was terrifyingly calm, and in that moment Amelia understood why people called him the Silent Death. Castellano's men hadn't even finished drawing their weapons before Nico fired the second and third shots. The two men holding Amelia collapsed at the same time, blood spraying across the floor. The man gripping Sophie's hair released her in panic and reached for his gun, but before his fingers touched the handle, a bullet tore straight through his forehead. Only Tony and one last thug remained. Both turned to run, but from the front door, Marco and Nico's guards stormed in like black specters. The fight was over in mere seconds. 5 men who had been snarling threats moments earlier now lay motionless on the floor, blood pooling beneath the dim oil lamp. Tony, the cowardly loan shark, dropped to his knees and begged for his life, sobbing that he had only followed Castellano's orders and never meant to hurt anyone. Nico stepped in front of him, looking down with eyes devoid of emotion, then turned to Marco and said in a voice cold as steel to take him away and make him understand the consequences of touching the people I protect. Marco nodded and signaled 2 guards to drag Tony outside, his screams fading until they vanished completely. Nico turned back to Amelia, who was sitting on the floor, her body shaking uncontrollably, blood still at the corner of her mouth, bruises blooming across her cheek. Sophie ran to her mother and clung to her, sobbing, while Ethan crawled out from under the table, his face drained white with fear. Nico extended his hand, palm up in a silent invitation, and spoke to Amelia in a voice far gentler than before, asking if she was badly hurt. Amelia stared at his hand, then at his face, unsure what she was supposed to feel. She had just been nearly killed by one group of Mafia men, only to be saved by another Mafia boss. She wanted to scream at him, to drive him away again, but she had no strength left. She accepted his hand, letting him pull her to her feet, and realized her legs were so weak she would have collapsed if he hadn't held her steady. "I warned you," Nico said, his voice low and deliberate. "They wouldn't stop. Victor Castellano, the man who ordered my shooting that night, knows I'm alive, and he knows you saved me. To him, you're a threat, a witness, a weakness he can use to get to me. He won't stop until you and your children are dead." Amelia felt the blood drain from her body as she listened. She pulled Sophie and Ethan into her arms, looked around the ruined house, at the bodies scattered across the floor, and she knew the fragile peace she had tried so desperately to protect had been destroyed forever the night she dragged this man into her home. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked, her voice exhausted and hollow. Nico looked at her and gave her 2 choices. 1, she could come with him to a safe place where Castellano couldn't reach her or the children. 2, she could stay here and wait for them to return, and next time he might not arrive in time. Amelia wanted to refuse, wanted to say she didn't need help from the Mafia, but then she looked down at Sophie trembling in her arms, at Ethan crying without a sound, and she knew she had no right to let her pride put her children in danger. "All right," she said, the word forced from her throat. "I'll go with you. But you have to promise me one thing." Nico looked at her, waiting. Amelia continued in the firmest voice she could manage. "Never let my children touch your world. I don't care who you are or what you do, but Sophie and Ethan must stay safe and clean. If you can't promise that, I'd rather die than follow you." Nico met her unwavering gaze, saw the way she held her children like a lioness guarding her cubs, and he nodded. "I promise," he said, his sincerity so real Amelia almost believed him instantly. "Your children will never have to touch my world. I'll protect them with my life." And that was the second promise Nico Moretti had spoken in 5 years. A promise made to the woman and the 2 children who had unknowingly stepped into his life on a fateful night of snow and storm. The convoy of black SUVs raced through the night, and when dawn finally broke along the horizon, Amelia saw the Moretti estate for the first time. She had thought she was prepared for what awaited her, but the reality went far beyond anything she could have imagined. This wasn't a house. It was a palace in miniature, set in the quiet countryside of Long Island, with ancient oak trees lining a stone-paved drive, endless stretches of manicured green lawn, and a 3-story ivory-white mansion crowned with massive Roman-style columns. Sophie and Ethan pressed their faces to the car windows, mouths open in silent awe. "Mom," Ethan whispered in wonder, "is this a castle? Are we going to live in a castle like princes and princesses?" Amelia didn't answer. She only held her children tighter as a deep unease spread through her chest. She didn't belong here. She knew it. She was a poor widow with hands roughened by labor, wearing worn clothes and tangled hair after a night of terror. She didn't belong in a world of grand estates and cars worth more than her life. The vehicles stopped before the main entrance, and Amelia saw dozens of servants lined up on either side of the steps, all dressed in immaculate black and white uniforms, bowing in unison as Nico stepped out. An elderly butler came forward to open Amelia's door, bowed politely, and welcomed her to the Moretti estate. Amelia stepped out with Sophie and Ethan, feeling like a fish thrown into completely foreign waters. She looked around at the marble statues in the garden, at the fountain where small stone angels blew water from their horns, at the towering windows draped in deep red velvet curtains, and she felt smaller than she ever had before. Nico stepped to her side and said softly that this would be her home and the children's for the time being, that she could use anything she needed and go anywhere she wished within the estate. Amelia was about to respond when a cold voice rang out from the front steps. "So this is the woman you brought back." Amelia lifted her head and saw an older woman descending the stairs. She wore an elegant black dress, silver hair swept into a flawless bun, her back straight as a ruler, and her gaze sharp as a blade as it swept openly over Amelia from head to toe. Rosa Moretti, Nico's mother, the powerful woman behind the most formidable Mafia family on the east coast of the United States. She stopped in front of Amelia, taking in her wrinkled clothes, the bruise blooming on her cheek, the 2 children hiding behind her, and the corner of her mouth curved into a mocking smile. "A poor widow with 2 small children," she said coldly. "This is what my son brings home after disappearing for nearly 3 weeks. Nico stepped forward, his voice firm as he said that she had saved his life. Rosa waved a hand as if it meant nothing. "In our world," she said, "saving someone's life doesn't mean they deserve trust. Who knows if she's a spy sent by Castellano? Who knows if she's pretending to be weak so she can infiltrate our family?" Amelia felt heat rush to her face, not from shame but from anger. She had endured too much in recent days, losing her home, being beaten, nearly watching her daughter die before her eyes, and now she was expected to stand here and be insulted like dirt by a stranger. She released her grip on the children, stepped forward, and lifted her chin to meet Rosa Moretti's icy gaze. "Madam," Amelia said, her voice calm but hard as steel, "if I had wanted to harm your son, I would have left him to freeze to death in the snowstorm instead of staying up all night removing a bullet from his chest. I didn't know who he was when I saved him. I only knew he was a human being who needed help, and I couldn't walk away. I didn't come here because I wanted to. I came because my children need to be safe, and I have no other choice. You can doubt me, despise me, even hate me. I don't care. I don't need your approval. I only need a safe place for my children until this is over. After that, I'll leave and never trouble your family again." Rosa Moretti stood still, her eyes widening slightly in surprise. In all her years ruling beside her husband, and then her son, she had met countless people, powerful ones, wealthy ones, ruthless ones, and all of them bowed before her, flattered her, feared her. Not a single one had ever dared look her in the eye and speak to her like this. Least of all a poor widow with nothing but 2 small children. She studied Amelia for a long moment, the unyielding eyes that didn't lower, the way she stood straight like a queen despite wearing torn clothes, and something shifted in Rosa's gaze. Not acceptance, not yet, but a trace of respect for the small yet fearless woman standing before her. She turned and walked away without another word, but just before disappearing through the doors, she paused and said that the woman and the children were to stay in the West Wing and be given everything they needed. It wasn't a warm welcome, but it wasn't an order to leave either. And in the world of the Moretti family, sometimes not being driven away was already a victory. 1 week passed inside the Moretti estate, and Amelia slowly grew accustomed to the new life, even though she never truly felt she belonged there. Sophie and Ethan were different. The children adapted with surprising ease, running freely through the vast gardens, befriending the servants' children, and gradually letting go of the horrifying memories of that night. Amelia was grateful that her children were happy, yet she kept her distance from everyone, especially from Nico. She couldn't deny that he had saved her life and her children's lives, but she also couldn't forget that he was a mafia boss, the head of a blood-soaked world she feared with every fiber of her being. Then that night came, the night when something between them began to shift. Amelia couldn't sleep, as had been the case every night since Michael died. She had grown used to waking around 2 o'clock in the morning and being unable to fall back asleep. She decided to go downstairs for a glass of water, and as she passed the grand living room, she noticed a faint glow of light inside. She was about to turn away, but something made her stop. A feeling, a quiet pull, perhaps an invisible call from within the room. She gently pushed the door open and saw Nico sitting alone in an armchair by the fireplace, an old photograph frame resting in his hands. He didn't look up. Either he didn't notice her, or he knew she was there and didn't care, because his eyes were fixed on the photograph with a depth of pain Amelia could feel from across the room. She was about to leave quietly when Nico spoke, his voice low and tired in the stillness. "You can't sleep either." Amelia paused, hesitated, then stepped inside and sat in the chair opposite him. "No," she replied softly. "I've gotten used to waking at this hour since my husband died." Nico nodded as if he understood, then looked back down at the photograph and fell silent for a long moment. Amelia didn't ask. She simply waited. Finally, Nico began to speak. "Catherine and Thomas," he said, his voice rough as if he were holding something back. "My wife and my son." Thomas was only 4 years old when he died. Amelia felt her heart tighten. She had heard him whisper those names in delirium the night she saved him, but she hadn't known who they were. Now she did. Nico continued, his eyes never leaving the photograph, as though he were speaking more to himself than to her. 5 years ago, he said, I was in a territorial war with Victor Castellano. He lost nearly half his empire to me, and he wanted revenge. But he didn't come for me. He came for my family. "A car bomb," he said, his voice trembling. Catherine was taking Thomas to school. They hadn't even made it past the estate gates when the car exploded. I heard the blast from inside the house. I ran out and saw the car burning with my wife and child trapped inside. He stopped, drew a deep breath, and Amelia saw tears glimmering in his gray eyes in the flickering firelight. "I couldn't save them," Nico continued, his voice breaking. "I stood there and watched them burn to death, unable to do anything. I swore I would protect them, and I failed. From that day on, I froze my heart. I didn't allow myself to love anyone again. I didn't allow myself to care about anyone again, because I was afraid that if I loved someone, they would die because of me." Amelia sat in silence, tears beginning to slide down her cheeks without her noticing. She looked at the man the world called a ruthless mafia boss, at the broad shoulders trembling under the weight of restrained grief, at the strong hands clutching the photograph as if it were the only thing left of his family. And she understood. She understood because she had lived that same pain. "I know that feeling," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a breath. "When my husband died, I was 3 months pregnant. The shock made me miscarry on the very day of his funeral. In one single day, I lost the man I loved and the child I never got to meet." Nico lifted his head and looked at her, and for the first time, Amelia saw not coldness or vigilance in his eyes, but recognition, the understanding of someone who had walked through the same hell. She went on, telling him about the nights she cried until there were no tears left, about the guilt of not being able to keep the child in her womb, about being blamed and cast out by her husband's family, about the months she endured everything alone while her heart continued to bleed in silence. And Nico listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He simply listened, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. When she finished, the room sank into silence, broken only by the soft crackle of burning wood in the fireplace. Then Nico spoke, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it before. "We're more alike than I thought," he said. "We've both lost the people we loved. We both carry wounds that will never fully heal. We're both trying to keep living even though our hearts are broken." Amelia looked at him, and in that moment, she no longer saw Nico Moretti, the mafia boss. She saw only a man who had lost everything, just like her, a man who was lonely and grieving, just like her. And for the first time since Michael died, Amelia felt that someone truly understood her pain. The next morning, while Amelia was having breakfast with the children in the small dining room reserved for them in the West Wing, Nico received an urgent call from Marco asking to see him immediately in the study. Nico stepped into the room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive oak desk, where Marco was already waiting with a thick folder in his hands and an unusually tense expression. Nico took his seat and motioned for him to begin, and what he heard over the next 15 minutes completely changed the way he saw everything. Marco opened the folder, laid photographs and documents across the desk, and began to explain in a low, deliberate voice. Michael Carter, Amelia's husband, did not die in a car accident, as the police concluded. He was murdered. His brakes were deliberately cut, and the person who ordered it was none other than Victor Castellano. Nico frowned and asked why Castellano would want to kill an ordinary man like Michael Carter. Marco turned to the next page and slid forward a still image taken from a security camera at a dock the night before Michael's death. In the image, Michael Carter was standing beside his car, and farther back a group of men were unloading cargo from a ship onto trucks. Cargo that Marco's investigation confirmed was cocaine worth millions of dollars, one of Castellano's largest shipments. Michael had taken a wrong turn and wandered into the dock area at the exact moment the deal was happening. He saw everything, and although he left immediately, the camera captured his image. Castellano would not accept the risk. He ordered the witness eliminated, and the following day Michael Carter died on a mountain road when his car lost its brakes. Nico sat there as if turned to stone, his gray eyes darkening as the pieces slowly locked together in his mind. The war between him and Castellano, the fight for territory and power he had waged for years, had indirectly caused Michael Carter's death. If he hadn't forced Castellano into a corner, the man might not have rushed to move his shipment at night through a remote dock. If there had been no war, Michael would never have accidentally seen what he wasn't meant to see. If it hadn't been for Nico, Amelia would still have her husband, still have the child she was carrying, still have a whole family instead of struggling to survive day by day with 2 small children and crushing debt. He hadn't pulled the trigger himself, but Michael Carter's blood was still on his hands. Marco watched his boss with concern and asked whether he wanted to tell Amelia. Nico remained silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on nothing as he thought. Finally, he shook his head. "No," he said heavily. "Not yet. She's been through too much. She's only just beginning to steady herself. If she learns the truth, she'll hate me, and I wouldn't blame her. But now isn't the time. Let me think." Marco nodded and left, leaving Nico alone with the weight of his new secret. He sat there for a long time, staring at the folder in front of him, wondering whether he had any right at all to stand beside the woman whose happiness his war had stolen. Meanwhile, in the west wing of the estate, Amelia stood by the window watching Sophie and Ethan play in the garden. She thought about the conversation she'd had with Nico the night before, about the story he'd told, about the pain he'd carried for 5 long years. She remembered the look in his eyes as he stared at the photograph of his wife and son, remembered the way his voice trembled when he spoke of their deaths, remembered how he listened to her talk about Michael and the child she lost without a single word of judgment. She had hated him, feared him, seen him as a monster, but after last night, she was beginning to see him differently. He wasn't a monster. He was a man shaped into something cold by unbearable loss. Just like her, he was trying to survive after losing everything, and maybe, just maybe, beneath that layer of ice, there was still a heart capable of love. Amelia shook her head, trying to chase those thoughts away. She shouldn't think of Nico that way, she told herself. He was Mafia. He was dangerous. He didn't belong to her world. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about his grief-filled gray eyes reflected in the flickering firelight the night before. The days that followed at the Moretti estate brought changes Amelia never expected. Nico began spending more time with Sophie and Ethan, not out of duty or obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to be with them. Every afternoon after finishing his work, he would head to the back garden where the children were playing, and the sight of the cold, feared Mafia boss kicking a soccer ball with a 6-year-old boy became such a familiar scene that even the household staff couldn't hide their surprise. Ethan was ecstatic beyond words, trailing Nico everywhere, calling Uncle Nico nonstop, proudly telling anyone who would listen that Uncle Nico was the best soccer player in the world. Sophie, shy and fragile with her weak heart, slowly opened herself to the man who had once frightened her. Nico carried her on his shoulders through the garden, pointing out different flowers and patiently naming each one. When Sophie said she liked the purple flowers growing on the trellis near the pond, Nico carried her there and lifted her high so she could pick them herself. Sophie's clear laughter rang through the garden, and Amelia watched from a distance, her heart melting little by little. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen her children laugh like that. Maybe before Michael died, before their world fell apart. And now, the person bringing that laughter back was a Mafia boss she had once hated and feared. Life could be cruelly ironic. One evening after dinner, as Amelia sat on the porch swing watching the children play with Nico in the fading sunset, Sophie ran up to her, cheeks flushed from running, a bright smile on her face. "Mom," she said with the innocent tone of a child asking the simplest thing in the world, "can Uncle Nico be my dad?" Amelia froze, not knowing how to answer. She glanced at Nico, standing a few steps away, his gray eyes fixed on her with an emotion she couldn't read. Sophie continued, her voice dropping as if she were sharing a secret. "I miss Daddy Michael a lot, but he's in heaven now and can't come back. Uncle Nico plays with me like Daddy used to. He carries me to pick flowers and tells me stories before bed. I want him to be my dad. Is that okay, Mom?" Amelia pulled her daughter into her arms, hiding the tear slipping down her cheek, and softly said, "Be a good girl. Let Mom think about it." Sophie nodded and ran back to play with Ethan, leaving Amelia and Nico in an awkward, heavy silence. That night, Amelia couldn't sleep again, and she went out to the garden for some air. She sat on the stone bench by the pond, watching the moon reflect on the still water, trying to sort through the chaos in her mind. Then she heard footsteps behind her, and when she turned, she saw Nico approaching. He said nothing, simply sat beside her on the bench, and together they stared at the star-filled sky in silence. At last, Nico spoke, his voice as gentle as the night breeze. "Do you know the flower Sophie picked this afternoon?" he asked. "It's a morning glory." Amelia shook her head and said she didn't know much about flowers. Nico smiled, one of those rare smiles Amelia realized she was beginning to like. He reached into his pocket and took out a small purple flower, placing it in her open palm. "Morning glories have something special about them," he said. "They bloom every morning and fade by afternoon. But the next day, new flowers bloom again. Every day is a new beginning. Every flower is a new chance." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes deep, as if they held an entire universe. "Maybe," he continued softly, "we can be like that too. Maybe we can start over, no matter how painful the past has been." Amelia looked into his eyes and felt herself sinking into them, pulled toward him by an invisible force she couldn't resist. The distance between them slowly closed, his warm breath brushing her lips, and Amelia closed her eyes, waiting for what she knew was about to happen. But in that instant, Michael's face flashed through her mind, his smile, his eyes, the promise he made to love her forever. She startled, turned away, stood up, and stepped back, her heart pounding wildly. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't. Not yet." Then she turned and hurried back inside, leaving Nico alone by the pond with the morning glory still resting on the stone bench. He didn't follow her. He understood she needed time, and he was willing to wait, because for the first time in 5 years of a frozen heart, Nico Moretti realized he was in love with a strong woman with sad eyes and a rare smile, in love with 2 children who called him uncle and asked if he could be their father, and he was willing to wait a lifetime if that was what it took, as long as one day she gave him a chance. Sophie's surgery day arrived faster than Amelia ever imagined, and she woke before dawn with a heart weighed down by fear. Nico had arranged everything: the best hospital in New York, the finest cardiovascular surgeon in the United States, a private luxury room, and a nursing team on duty 24 hours a day. Amelia didn't ask where the money came from. She knew the answer would make her uncomfortable, but she also knew she had no right to refuse when her daughter's life was hanging by a thread. That morning, Nico personally drove Amelia and Sophie to the hospital, while Ethan stayed behind at the estate with Rosa, who promised him ice cream if he behaved. Sophie sat quietly in the car, her small face pale with anxiety, but she didn't cry. She held her mother's hand tightly and occasionally glanced at Nico through the rearview mirror. At the hospital, after the paperwork was finished and Sophie was taken to the preoperative room, she suddenly asked to speak to Nico. "Uncle Nico," she whispered, "could you promise me something?" Nico stepped to her bedside, knelt to her eye level, and asked what she wanted him to promise. Sophie looked at him with wide eyes full of trust and said, "Promise you'll be here when I wake up. I'm scared I won't see anyone. I'm scared of being alone." Nico felt his chest tighten. He took her small hand in his and said with the firmest voice he could manage that he promised, "When you wake up, I'll be right here. I won't go anywhere." Sophie smiled, a small smile that eased some of the fear in her eyes, and then she closed them as the anesthesia took effect. Amelia stood beside them, tears streaming down her face, silently thanking God for bringing Nico into their lives, even though she still couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. The operating room doors closed, and 6 hours of waiting began. Amelia sat on the hallway bench, hands clasped, praying nonstop, her lips moving with pleas only God could hear. Nico sat beside her, silent, motionless like a stone statue, but inside him raged an emotional storm he had never known before. For the first time in his life, the most powerful mafia boss on the east coast of the United States felt completely helpless. He could order deaths, control an empire, force the most powerful men to bow, but he couldn't do a single thing to save the 8-year-old girl lying on the operating table behind those doors. All he could do was sit and wait, like any ordinary man, and that helplessness nearly drove him insane. Time crawled by as if each second were stretched into eternity. Amelia prayed until her voice grew hoarse, until she had no tears left to cry. And throughout those 6 hours, Nico never left her side for even a moment. He didn't speak, but his presence was the anchor Amelia needed more than any words of comfort. Finally, the operating room doors opened, and the doctor stepped out with a smile. "The surgery was a success," he said. "She's out of danger now. Her heart is as healthy as any normal child's." Amelia collapsed, sobbing with relief, and without thinking, she threw her arms around Nico as if he were the only lifeline left in a vast ocean. Nico froze for a second, then slowly wrapped his arms around her, letting her cry against his chest, silently thanking God even though he didn't believe in God. Sophie was moved to recovery, and Amelia and Nico sat beside her bed waiting for her to wake. The joy spread quickly, but it hadn't even settled before Nico's phone vibrated with a call from Marco. And what he heard made his blood run cold. "Castellano has made his move," Marco said urgently. "He attacked the estate while we were at the hospital. He took Madame Rosa hostage. And there's more. He knows where we are." At that moment, gunshots echoed down the hospital corridor, followed by screams from patients and nurses and the sound of panicked footsteps. Nico sprang to his feet, drew the gun he always carried, and looked at Amelia with eyes filled with alarm. "They're here," he said, his voice cold as steel. "Don't leave this room. Protect Sophie at all costs." Then he charged out into the hallway, leaving Amelia standing there with her heart pounding in terror. She looked at Sophie, still unconscious on the bed, then toward the door as the gunfire drew closer, and she knew that the blood-soaked war she had feared most had finally arrived. Nico burst into the hallway with a gun in his hand, his mind spinning between two choices that couldn't have been more unbearable. His mother was being held hostage at the estate. Amelia and Sophie were under immediate threat in this very hospital, and he was alone. He couldn't be in two places at once. He had to choose, and that decision felt like a blade tearing his heart apart. He called Marco over the sound of gunfire, his voice cold as steel even though chaos raged inside him. "Bring everyone to the estate and save my mother," he ordered. "I'll handle things here." Marco protested, warning that Castellano had dozens of gunmen in the hospital, and Nico couldn't face them alone. Nico didn't listen. He cut the call and moved toward the growing echo of gunshots. He knew exactly why Castellano had chosen this moment to strike. When his forces were divided, when he was in a public place where he couldn't unleash his full power, when the people he cared about were close enough to be used as leverage. Castellano had waited for this opportunity, and he'd chosen the perfect moment to deliver a killing blow. Nico took down 2 men at the end of the corridor, then 3 more near the stairwell. He moved like a ghost, swift and precise, every bullet taking a life. But there were too many enemies, and as he rounded a corner, a bullet tore through his left shoulder. He staggered but didn't fall. The pain burned like fire through his body, but he didn't stop. He kept fighting, kept shooting, kept pushing forward toward Sophie's room, like a demon that didn't know how to feel pain. Then he appeared. Victor Castellano stepped out from the far end of the hallway, his snake-like eyes fixed on Nico with triumph. "Moretti," he called out with sick pleasure. "I finally found your weakness. Who would have thought the cold-blooded killer could love, could have someone to lose? First your wife and son, now the widow and her children. Don't you ever learn?" Nico clenched his teeth, blood soaking his shirt from his shoulder, his eyes colder than ice. "5 years ago you killed my wife and child," he said, his voice low and slow like a funeral bell. "Today you pay for it." Castellano laughed and waved his men to surround him. "You think you can win," he sneered. "You're bleeding. You're alone. You're trying to protect the weak people in that room. You lost the moment you allowed yourself to love anyone." The battle exploded in the hospital corridor. Nico fought like a cornered beast, every punch and every shot driven by desperation. Another bullet slammed into his thigh, but he stayed on his feet, kept fighting, remained the final wall between his enemies and the people he loved. Inside the hospital room, Amelia heard the gunfire drawing closer, and knew Nico was risking his life to protect them. She scanned the room for anything she could use as a weapon, and her eyes locked onto the metal IV stand beside Sophie's bed. She had just lifted it when the door was kicked open and one of Castellano's men stormed in with a gun. He spotted Sophie lying motionless on the bed and curled his lips into a cruel smile, moving toward her with obvious intent. But he underestimated a mother protecting her child. Amelia didn't think. She rushed him with the IV stand and drove it straight into his neck with every ounce of strength she had. He collapsed, blood pouring out, and Amelia stood there shaking, her hands covered in blood, unable to believe what she'd just done. There was no time to process it. She ran back to Sophie's bed, shielding her daughter with her own body, ready to die if that was what it took to protect her child. Out in the hallway, Nico had run out of bullets and was fighting Castellano hand to hand. Both men were covered in wounds, both at the absolute limit of their strength, neither willing to fall. Just as Castellano raised his gun to finish Nico, gunfire erupted behind him. Marco and the guards arrived in time, flooding the corridor like a black tide, cutting down Castellano's remaining men in seconds. Castellano was shot in the leg and collapsed, his gun skidding across the floor. Nico staggered upright and stepped toward his lifelong enemy, staring down at him with ice-cold eyes. Castellano waited for death, waited for Nico to execute him the way he'd murdered Nico's wife and son 5 years earlier. But Nico didn't shoot. He remembered his promise to Amelia, his promise not to drag her children into his bloody world. He looked at Castellano and said with quiet contempt that you'll rot in prison for the rest of your life, and that's worse than death. Then he turned to Marco and ordered him to call the police and hand Castellano over with every piece of evidence of his crimes over the past 30 years. Castellano screamed in rage, but his voice vanished as the police stormed in, cuffed him, and dragged him away. Nico watched until he disappeared from sight. Then his legs gave out and he collapsed into Marco's arms. "Take me to Sophie's room," he whispered before losing consciousness. I promised I'd be there when she woke up. 2 days after the battle at the hospital, everything slowly returned to calm. Nico's wounds were treated by the doctors, and he was placed in a recovery room right next to Sophie's, refusing the private VIP floor because he wanted to stay close to the little girl. Castellano had been taken into federal custody, along with dozens of pieces of evidence detailing his crimes over the past 30 years. More than enough to ensure he would rot in prison for the rest of his life, just as Nico had said. Rosa was rescued safely, suffering only a few minor scratches and enough fury to curse Castellano down 18 levels of hell. Part of the Moretti estate had been damaged, but no lives were lost. And for the first time in many years, the Moretti family could finally breathe again, knowing their greatest enemy had been dragged into the light. That afternoon, as Amelia sat beside Sophie's bed, holding her daughter's hand and praying softly, Sophie's eyes slowly opened. She looked around the room, still drowsy from medication, and when she saw her mother beside her, she smiled weakly and said, "Mom, I dreamed about Dad." Amelia choked back a sob, squeezed her daughter's hand tighter, and asked what her father had said. Sophie closed her eyes as if trying to remember, then whispered that Dad said he was happy Mom wasn't alone anymore, that from heaven he could see Mom had someone beside her to take care of her and of Ethan. He said he loved us, but he wanted Mom to be happy. He wanted Mom to allow herself to be loved again. Tears streamed down Amelia's face as she bent to kiss her daughter's forehead and whispered that she loved her. Sophie smiled, then looked toward the doorway where Nico was standing, his shoulder wrapped in white bandages, his face still pale from blood loss, but his gray eyes bright as they met hers. "Uncle Nico," Sophie said happily, "you kept your promise. You were here when I woke up." Nico stepped into the room, sat beside the bed across from Amelia, and gently took Sophie's small hand in his large one. "I promised," he said softly. So softly Amelia barely recognized his voice. "And I'll always keep my promises to you." Sophie smiled and drifted back to sleep, the peaceful rest of a child who was finally safe. Amelia and Nico sat there in silence for a long moment, watching her sleep. Then Nico stood and said he needed to talk to Amelia outside. They walked into the hallway to a quiet corner where the afternoon sunlight filtered through the windows, casting golden streaks across the floor. Nico stood with his back to the light, silent for a long time, as if searching for the right words, then finally spoke, his voice heavy as if carrying an unbearable weight. "Amelia, there's something I need to tell you. About Michael. About his death." Amelia looked at him, worry flickering in her eyes, but she nodded for him to continue. Nico told her everything Marco had uncovered. How Michael had accidentally witnessed Castellano's deal at the harbor. How Castellano ordered him killed to eliminate a witness. How the brakes were cut and the crash staged. He also told her the most painful truth of all, that the war between him and Castellano might have forced Castellano to move the shipment that night, and that indirectly, Nico bore some responsibility for Michael's death. Amelia stood in silence throughout his confession, her face unreadable, and that silence tortured Nico more than any accusation could have. He waited for her to scream at him, to drive him away again, to tell him she hated him and never wanted to see him again. But instead, Amelia stepped closer, placed a hand over his chest where his heart was racing, and looked into his eyes with tears glistening, but no hatred in them. "Did you kill Michael?" she asked. "No," Nico answered. "Did you know him before you met me?" "No." "Did you order Castellano to do it?" "No. Castellano was my enemy. He acted on his own." Amelia nodded, then said in a trembling but steady voice that then it wasn't his fault. It was Castellano's, and Castellano would pay. He already had. Nico had avenged Michael without knowing it, without intending to, by putting his killer in prison, and that was enough. "I don't hate you, Nico," she said. "I can't hate the man who saved my daughter's life, who nearly died protecting us." Nico stared at her, stunned. He had braced himself for hatred, for rejection, for losing her forever. He hadn't prepared for forgiveness. Before he could speak, a voice came from behind them. "My daughter-in-law is truly an extraordinary woman." They turned to see Rosa Moretti standing there, her eyes no longer cold but softened with something close to affection. She stepped forward and, to everyone's surprise, embraced Amelia. "Thank you," Rosa whispered through tears. "Thank you for bringing my son's soul back to life. For 5 years he was like a walking corpse, but since meeting you, I've seen him live again. You saved him twice, once his body and once his heart. I don't need a wealthy or powerful daughter-in-law. I only need someone who loves my son and my grandchildren, and you are that person." Amelia stood in Rosa's arms, tears streaming down her face, and for the first time since Michael died, she felt that she truly had a family again. 1 month passed since Castellano was arrested, and Amelia's life with her children had changed completely. Sophie recovered so quickly that even the doctors were surprised, running through the estate with Ethan as if a heart condition had never once threatened her life. Rosa Moretti became the grandmother the children had never had, teaching Sophie how to bake and telling Ethan stories about distant Italy where their ancestors once lived. As for Amelia, she slowly learned how to open her heart again, how to trust again, how to allow herself to be happy after so many months of pain. One weekend afternoon, Nico came to her and said he wanted to take her somewhere, just the two of them. Amelia was surprised but agreed, leaving Sophie and Ethan with Rosa and getting into the car with Nico without asking where they were going. The car left the estate and followed familiar country roads, and when Amelia realized the direction they were heading, her heart began to race. They were returning to her old wooden house, the place where everything began, where she had dragged a dying man out of a snowstorm and unknowingly changed both their destinies. But when the car stopped and Amelia stepped out, she couldn't believe her eyes. The rickety wooden house she once lived in, with its leaking roof and cracked walls where wind slipped through every gap, had been completely transformed. It kept its original structure, still the warm wooden home she loved, but everything had been restored perfectly. A new roof, sealed walls, clear glass windows, and around the house a small garden filled with blooming morning glory flowers glowing in the afternoon sun. Amelia stood there, tears spilling freely, and turned to Nico with eyes full of shock and emotion. "You did all this?" she asked, her voice breaking. Nico nodded and stepped closer, taking her trembling hands in his. "This is my gift to you," he said softly and sincerely. "Whether you choose to live here or at the estate or anywhere else, you'll always have a place to come home to. This house is where you saved my life, where my life changed forever, and I wanted it to be the most beautiful place in the world, worthy of the woman who gave me a chance to live again." Amelia couldn't speak. She just stood there, looking at the house, the garden, and the man in front of her with gray eyes filled with a love she hadn't realized she'd grown to cherish. Then Nico did something that left her stunned. He slowly knelt before her, one knee touching the ground, his eyes lifting to hers with all the sincerity he had. "Amelia," he said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion, "I'm not good with beautiful words. My life has been filled with darkness and sin. My hands are stained with blood, and I don't deserve a pure woman like you. But you changed me. You and Sophie and Ethan gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. A reason to live, a meaning to exist, a family to love and protect. You're the miracle of my life, Amelia. You appeared in a snowstorm like an angel, pulling me out of the darkness not just once but over and over again. You saved my life, then you saved my soul, and now I'm kneeling here asking you to give me the chance to spend my life by your side." He paused, took a deep breath, then continued with steady determination. "I'm asking to be your husband, to be Sophie and Ethan's father, to be the protector of our family until my final breath, and I promise you, I'll walk away completely from the underworld. I'll hand everything over to Marco and manage only legitimate businesses. I'll become a normal man, a normal husband, a normal father, if that's what you need. I'll do anything to be with you, Amelia. Please give me that chance." Amelia stood there with tears streaming down her face, looking at the most powerful man on the east coast of the United States, kneeling before her like an ordinary man proposing to the woman he loved. She remembered the first time she met him, a blood-soaked man dying in a snowstorm. She remembered the days she cared for him, the nights she stayed awake by his bed, the moments she hated him and drove him away. She remembered the way he looked at her children, the way he carried Sophie to pick flowers, the way he taught Ethan to kick a ball, the way he nearly died protecting them, and she remembered Sophie's dream, Michael saying he was happy she wasn't alone anymore. "I've loved you for a long time," Amelia said, her voice shaking with joy. "I was just afraid to admit it because I thought I didn't deserve happiness again. But now I understand. Loving again isn't betraying Michael. It's continuing to live the way he wanted me to live. And I want to live beside you, Nico. I want you to be my husband, the father of my children, our family." Nico stood up, tears shining in his eyes without shame, and he pulled Amelia into his arms as if she were the most precious treasure in the world. They stood there in the garden filled with morning glory flowers, golden sunset light wrapping around them like a warm blanket. And when Nico leaned down and kissed Amelia, their first kiss, the world seemed to stand still. It was the kiss of two broken hearts that had found each other, of two lonely souls that had found a home, of a love born from darkness, yet reaching for the light. And the morning glory flowers around them swayed in the evening breeze as if blessing a new beginning. 2 weeks after the proposal in the garden filled with morning glory flowers, Nico and Amelia's wedding was held at the Moretti estate. It wasn't a lavish ceremony with hundreds of guests as people might expect from the most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast, but a simple and intimate celebration shared only with those closest to them. Rosa had sewn Amelia's wedding dress herself, an elegant white gown with delicate morning glory embroidery running along the hem, and when Amelia put it on, Rosa wept with emotion and said her daughter-in-law looked more beautiful than an angel. Marco served as the master of ceremonies, the normally cold man who always stayed at Nico's side, now wearing a perfectly tailored black suit and showing a rare smile. The garden behind the estate was decorated with thousands of morning glory flowers, forming a pathway leading to a floral arch where Nico stood waiting. What moved everyone the most, however, was Sophie and Ethan, the two children walking ahead of Amelia as the flower girl and ring bearer. Sophie wore a small white dress with a floral crown on her head, scattering petals from a basket in her hands, while Ethan wore a black suit identical to Nico's and solemnly carried a velvet pillow holding the wedding rings. When Amelia reached Nico beneath the floral arch, her heart beat so fast she thought it might burst with happiness. She looked at the man waiting for her, his gray eyes shining brighter than she'd ever seen, and she knew she'd made the right choice. Before the pastor began the ceremony, Nico raised his hand and asked to speak first. He knelt before Sophie and Ethan, bringing his eyes level with theirs, and spoke in a voice trembling with emotion. "Before I make my vows to your mother, I want to make a vow to you first. Sophie, Ethan, I know you've lost your father, and I can never replace Michael in your hearts, but I'm asking you to give me another place. The place of someone who'll love you as his own children, who'll protect you with his life, who'll be there for you in every joy and sorrow of your lives. I want to be your father, if you'll allow me. I promise I'll never let you be afraid or suffer. I'll never let anyone hurt you, and I'll always be the place you can lean on. Will you let me be your father?" Sophie and Ethan looked at each other, then both children threw themselves into Nico's arms, holding him tightly as if afraid he might disappear. "Dad!" Sophie cried through her tears. "I want you to be my dad." "Daddy!" Ethan shouted, with uncontainable joy. "I have a dad now. I have a dad." And then something no one expected happened. Nico Moretti, the cold Mafia boss known as the Silent Death, the man who hadn't cried even while burying his wife and child 5 years earlier because he believed tears were weakness, cried. Tears streamed down his face as he held the two children, and he didn't hide them, because these were tears of happiness, of healing, of a heart frozen for 5 years, finally melting. Marco turned away to wipe his eyes. Rosa sobbed into her handkerchief, and Amelia stood watching with a heart overflowing with love. After composing himself, Nico stood and turned to Amelia, taking her hands in his. "You're the miracle of my life," he said, his voice still shaking. "You saved me from the darkness, gave me a reason to live, and brought me a family I thought I'd lost forever. I vow to love you, protect you, and care for you until my final breath. And every day, I'll love you more than the day before. Like morning glory flowers that bloom each morning with new blossoms, my love for you will grow fresher and stronger every day. You're my wife, my life partner, the other half of my soul, and I'll spend my life proving you weren't wrong to choose me." Amelia spoke her vows with a voice choked by happiness, and when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Nico leaned down and kissed her amid applause and cheers. Sophie and Ethan ran to embrace them, and the four of them stood beneath the morning glory arch as a complete family. The Moretti family was no longer just Nico and Rosa. Now it included Amelia, Sophie, and Ethan, the perfect pieces that finally filled the emptiness in their hearts. 1 year after the wedding, the small wooden house where Amelia once lived through her hardest days had become Morning Glory Ranch, a peaceful farm nestled in the lush countryside of New York. Nico kept his promise. He withdrew completely from the underworld and handed over all operational control to Marco, keeping only legitimate businesses such as hotels and real estate. He was no longer the feared Mafia boss people once called the Silent Death. He was simply Nico Moretti, a husband who loved his wife, a father who loved his children, and an ordinary businessman like so many others. Sophie was now 9 years old. The little girl whose heart had once been so fragile that doctors said she wouldn't survive the winter was now healthy and full of life. Every afternoon after school, she went to the stables to learn horseback riding with a private instructor Nico had hired, and her clear laughter echoed across the ranch like the happiest melody. 7-year-old Ethan followed his father everywhere like a small shadow. He learned how to tend the garden, how to fix little things around the house, and proudly told everyone that he would grow up to be a strong man just like Dad Nico. As for Amelia, she was 5 months pregnant, her belly round and full, and Nico wouldn't let her do any heavy work. Every morning he brought her breakfast in bed. Every evening he massaged her feet. Every night he pressed his ear to her belly to listen to the baby's heartbeat, as if it were the most miraculous sound in the world. The doctor said it was a baby girl, and they named her Catherine, in memory of Nico's first wife, a woman Amelia knew would always have a place in her husband's heart, and she accepted that completely. Rosa lived with them on the ranch, becoming the most wonderful grandmother Sophie and Ethan could ever wish for, and she eagerly awaited the arrival of her new granddaughter. One afternoon, Margaret Carter, Michael's mother, appeared at the gates of Morning Glory Ranch, her expensive clothes now faded and her pride broken. After Michael's death and the loss of Nico's indirect business support, the Carter estate had fallen into bankruptcy. She pleaded with Amelia for financial help, the same woman she had once thrown out like trash. Amelia looked at her former mother-in-law with neither hatred nor pity, and simply reminded her that she had already been given a decaying wooden cabin, which was more than enough for a home. As the gates closed, Amelia felt the final weight of the past lift from her shoulders, knowing that justice had finally found its way home. That evening, as the sunset painted the sky in gold and the morning glory flowers folded their petals to rest before blooming again at dawn, Nico sat in the living room holding the family Bible. It was the Bible he'd bought after the wedding, where he recorded important family events as generations before him had done. He turned to the last blank page, dipped his pen in ink, and began to write in the simplest, most honest handwriting he could manage. The Moretti Carter family was born from a storm, bound together by love and sacrifice. From darkness, we found light. From loss, we found hope. From 2 broken hearts, we built a whole family. Love heals all wounds, and each new day is a new chance to love more deeply. Like the morning glory that blooms each morning, our love will grow fresher and stronger with every passing day. Let this day be recorded so future generations will know they come from a family built on love, forgiveness, and faith in new beginnings. Amelia stepped up behind him, placed her hand on his shoulder, and read what he had written. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they were tears of happiness. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Nico replied, pulling her down onto his lap. They sat there in the warm light, looking out the window where Sophie and Ethan were playing with the golden retriever Nico had bought them the week before. Rosa stood on the porch, smiling with quiet contentment as she watched her grandchildren play. The morning glory flowers in the garden had closed their petals, resting silently in the dark, ready to bloom again when morning came, like a promise of beautiful days ahead. This wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. A chapter written in love, faith, and hope. A chapter neither Nico nor Amelia would have dared to dream of during the darkest days of their lives, but which was now unfolding right before their eyes. And somewhere in heaven, perhaps Michael was smiling down, happy that the woman he loved had found happiness again, and Catherine and Thomas were smiling too, because the man they loved had finally learned how to love once more. Amelia and Nico's story reminds us that no matter how deeply life pushes us into darkness, there's always light at the end of the tunnel. That kindness and compassion, no matter how small, can change a person's destiny. That true love isn't afraid of the past, of scars, or of differences. It only needs two hearts willing to open and accept one another. And that family isn't created only by blood, but by the choice to love, care for, and protect each other through every storm. If you're going through difficult days, please remember that after the rain, the sky always clears, and sometimes miracles come from the places we least expect. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If Amelia and Nico's story touched your heart, please like and share this video with the people you love, those who also need to be reminded that love and hope still exist. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the heartfelt stories we bring you every day. We'd truly love to hear your thoughts. How did Amelia and Nico's story make you feel? Did it remind you of something in your own life? Have you ever received help from a stranger who later became someone important to you? Please leave a comment below and share the stories and emotions from deep within your heart. We read and reply to every single comment. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and a heart always filled with love. Remember that every new day is a new chance to love and be loved, just like morning glory flowers blooming fresh each morning. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.